Okay, so good morning, everyone. Afternoon or evening, depending where in the world you are. Welcome to the latest in our FOSI Briefs the Hill series. My name is Stephen Balcom, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Family Online Safety Institute. Our mission is to make the online world safer for kids and their families, and we work in what we call the 3 Ps of policy, practices, and parenting. That is enlightened public policy, robust industry best practices, and good digital parenting. One of the most important roles that we have as an organization is to convene the best thinkers and practitioners in the field of online safety to collaborate and innovate in this space. And so today's gathering will focus on the role public policy is increasingly playing in the work and practice of online safety. Now, as many of you are aware, the US Congress has recently advanced legislation focused on children's online safety, children's online privacy, and comprehensive data privacy. These are COSA, COPPA 2.0, and the ADPPA, or the Three Corners Bill, respectively. In July, each bill was amended and passed out of its relevant committee and now await action in the full House and Senate. Despite this progress, the path to becoming law is far from guaranteed. Separately, states have also begun to take action on their own, including in California, where they recently passed the Age-Appropriate Design Code Act into law, and 5 states have passed their own data privacy laws. Other countries are even further ahead, with the UK already enforcing its Age-Appropriate Design Code, and the EU, which passed its comprehensive data privacy law in 2016, is moving forward with the Digital Services Act. So to help us navigate these waters, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Andrew Zach, and to a wonderful panel of experts. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm really excited for this conversation today as we bring on our fellow panelists. I'll briefly introduce myself and then hand it over to them for their introductions. So again, I'm Andrew Zach, Policy Manager of FOSI. And before that, I was working in the Senate as a colleague of Jamie's. So I'll turn it over to her.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Suskin. I am the Tech Policy Advisor for Senator Marsha Blackburn. My boss is the ranking member on the Senate Commerce Committee's Consumer Protection Subcommittee, which gives her jurisdiction over these issues. She's also on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as a couple of other committees. I spent some time in the tech sector prior to being here, was on the Hill before, and spent nearly a decade working at the FCC. But thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks very much. How about Lauren?
Hi, my name is Lauren Merck. I am a policy counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum here in Washington, D.C., and I'm on the Youth and Education Privacy team, where I focus on student and young people's privacy in EdTech and as consumers.
Excellent. Thank you. And last but not least.
Hi, I'm Adam Kovakovich. I am the CEO and founder of Chamber of Progress, which is a center-left tech industry association. We're focused primarily on working with democratic policymakers at federal, state, and local levels on technology policy and charting a path that hopefully captures the good of technology while also regulating its downsides and abuses.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all. And just a reminder to our audience that we will be taking questions. So please send us any that you have during the conversation through the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So let's dive in and start with safety. Jamie, as you mentioned, your boss is the ranking member of the Commerce Subcommittee and one of the 2 leaders on the Kids Online Safety Act. So for starters, what is COSA? What is the bill's intent? Why is it so important that we have an online safety bill before Congress right now?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. So as Andrew said, COSA passed out of Senate Commerce few months ago now, and it was by a unanimous vote of 28-0, which we really appreciated. So my boss, along with the chairman of the subcommittee, Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, had convened a series of hearings looking at the impacts of online platforms and how they are impacting kids and teens in particular. We had several platforms come as witnesses. We had researchers, other folks that are engaged in the space, and probably no surprise, right? The things that we had heard were disturbing. I think parents and physicians, if there are any on this call, would probably say that these are similar things that they're hearing. Every time my boss goes back to Tennessee, she'll come back with stories just about, things she's hearing from parents and physicians and educators. So, in short, KOSA basically sets out a framework to give kids and parents the safeguards, tools, and transparency that they would need to protect against threats to their kids and teens' mental health and well-being online. Basically, it creates an environment where we want online platforms to put kids and teens' interests first and provide an environment that is safe by default. Happy to walk quickly through a few of the sections. For example, it establishes a duty of care in product design, which, once we talk a little bit about some of the states, about California and things like that, you'll kind of hear that that's similar, but basically a duty of care that platforms that are likely to have kids and teens on their site have to act in the best interests of minors. We define that with respect to certain types of content that would be on the site. And I should say that this isn't necessarily a Section 230 content moderation issue, though we can certainly have that conversation. We require certain safeguards to be set out for minors and parental tools that would be turned on by default, but then parents, along with, having conversations with their kids and their teens, can certainly turn those off. We want to make sure that there is a reporting mechanism to make sure that when, parents find out, for example, their child, there's a video that's online and it's bullying their child, that there's a way to reach out to platforms to get things like that taken down. We have some language about audit requirements for companies in this space and working with the FTC to provide transparency about what they're doing. We talk about opening platforms up for independent research, which could probably be a whole panel in and of itself. And I know there's other legislation out there that's also focused on that topic. A big thing that my boss, I will say, was a little bit disturbed by when we had the hearings was finding out that some companies are doing market research on kids as young as 8 years old. So we are requiring the FTC to create guidance for platforms that are seeking to do market and product focused research on minors. We look a little bit into the age assurance issue, which I know is a very tricky thing to figure out, and that platforms are grappling with every day, trying to engage NIST in it to see if there's something that can be done there at the device level. Creating a kids online safety council, which I know that a bunch of folks have talked to us about, which would have parents and experts and representatives from platforms, state AGs, things like that. So everybody could try to figure out basically the best way to put the provisions in the act into effect. And we give them some specific guidance. So those are kind of the main things, but happy to talk in more detail.
Thank you. No, that was a really good overview. And as anyone can say after hearing that, it is a sweeping bill. It is a really ambitious, significant bill. And just one side note on as the Family Online Safety Institute, the Kids Online Safety Council, definitely supportive of that. And we want to be very involved and help the discourse and help shape regulation there. One quick follow-up. I think I heard you mention, so in addition to specific harms that the bill is trying to prevent, it's also, the KOSA is also trying to be almost a minimum standard for online safety, or you mentioned by default, having some privacy controls, having some safety controls. So it's kind of trying to do a little bit of specific harm prevention and broader baseline safety. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it is about baseline safety, certainly. I think that we spell out some certain harms, I think, to provide some clarity. It's in the Section 3B under the duty of care, right? And they It's kind of a big list, but at the same time, it's the categories of things like self-harm and, eating disorder, substance abuse, right? Illegal drugs online, like some of the things that we've really heard about as a problem. So it's a baseline, but then there's also certain things that we try to target, right? We also, we look at certain behaviors like dark patterns and things that, kind of encourage addiction in kids too. So that is also built in there as part of some of the things we're trying to look at and setting a minimum standard for safety. But I think as far as looking at specific issues, it's more to provide clarity for the folks that would need to implement it than it's necessarily us saying, okay, we're looking at drug use, so that's what we're focused on.
Excellent. Thank you. No, that's really helpful to get a sense of the motivation and the purpose of the bill. I want to open it to Lauren and Adam, and especially starting off after that. What do you see as the main benefits of COSA? What parts or implications of this bill are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think we can all agree that keeping young people safe and healthy online is an important and worthy goal. So I really appreciate that this bill is trying to address those very real concerns about young users' well-being, especially when they use emerging tech. Now, something else I appreciate is that the bill affords protections not only to children, but also teens, specifically young people under 17. And that speaks to this growing trend we've been seeing in the youth privacy and online safety space of, state and federal and, legislators from around the world caring about not only children under 13, as has been the historic norm, to also including teenagers in the conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah, and in terms of, I think, good things in the bill, I think there's two things I call out. Jamie talked about the provisions to directing NIST to research on device level age verification. I think that's very interesting. Age verification, as I think many people know, has been one of these really challenging things. There are some interesting pilots being done. There are other examples of technology, for example, new video game consoles that have an interesting approach there. And so I think that's well worth additional research. And then the other is just the bill's encouragement and direction for platform services to provide parental tools. Requirement for those tools to include tracking kids, use and time, restricting purchases, financial transactions, the ability to control privacy and account settings. Those are good. I think that's well in line with the trends we've seen over the last couple of years with what platforms are doing already. We just saw, for example, the new version of iOS 16 has some really interesting parental controls for age-appropriate restrictions for apps and books and TVs and music. Instagram has just been rolling out over the last couple of months new parental controls and user controls for teenagers in particular. And so encouraging more platforms to do that kind of thing, I think, is a worthy goal.
Excellent. Thank you. And on the flip side, what are some areas, knowing that this is still a bill that has passed committee but has not yet passed the Senate, so there might be some opportunities to improve, what sections do you think are maybe potentially concerning or would love to have some more clarity on to see this bill improved a little bit?
I'll just, I think there's two things in particular that I think jump out to me as concerns. And Jay mentioned the duty of care. I think one of the things we see, a duty of care, is on its face sort of directing platforms to use their best efforts to essentially, act responsibly, but it creates liability for platforms if they don't. And one of the things that we've seen in bills like, for example, FOSTA SESTA that have created more liability is this habit of platforms to over remove content, right? And so you get into the situation where there is edge case content that might be beneficial, but where a platform looks at this and says, I don't know, I feel like this is just too close to being something that we could be held liable for hosting, and they end up removing content that might be, a lifeline for the teen who's seeking a refuge in an online community, or content that's hard to find at their school, right? The other concern is that, from my perspective, is that it gives state attorneys general the ability to bring actions against platforms when it says the state's residents are, quote, threatened or adversely affected by the engagement of any person or practice that violates the act. And so you're leaving it up to individual state attorneys general to decide which topics online pose a risk to the physical or mental health of a minor. In many cases, that might be fine, but I think we've also, frankly, seen kind of MAGA, attorneys general use this kind of thing. There was just last week, for example, a report from the Heritage Foundation that said that online platforms are essentially encouraging kids to become trans because of providing information about that. And I think that that I vehemently disagree with that. But you could see maybe a state attorneys general pushing that idea on a platform, and that there's a risk there.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, I just have a few questions that I think could use some clarification. And Jamie, if you have answered, that'd be great. One question I have is about the distinction between child and minor. So I know that both terms are defined in the bill, with child meaning under 13 and minor meaning under 17, which would suggest that all minors are, or all children are minors, but not all minors are children. However, I noticed that there are specific sections to parent safeguards as well as specific sections to minor safeguards. And so my question would be, do children have access to all of the same safeguards that do minors and do children and teens both have the same, set of safeguards? And similarly, do parents have equal access to safeguards for their children as they would to their teens or young adult kids? And so that's one question that I would appreciate some clarification on. And then another question that often comes up with these child privacy and safety bills is how they would interact with education technology and education privacy laws. And youth and education privacy is such an interesting area because you have the laws that govern kids as consumers, like COPPA, but you also have these laws governing kids as students, like FERPA. And I understand that KOSA wouldn't supersede FERPA, nor would it preempt state student privacy laws. But I'm curious if there is potential for unintended consequences on education technology. For example, many education technology products use algorithmic systems to provide content based on a student's performance to help them meet certain benchmarks. Could KOSA's provisions about controlling or opting out of algorithmic recommendations interfere with an edtech platform's ability to provide personalized content? And could this have unintentional consequences on the benefits that edtech algorithms might offer to a student and their education?
Great point. Thank you for also bringing in the ed tech and kids in school. As we know, back to school season, kids have been more online than ever, especially with school and now with homework as well. Jamie, would love to open it up if you want to respond to any of this or hear your thoughts before moving on a little bit.
Yes, I was taking notes. Hold on. Okay. So I'm happy to respond. Let me start with Adams. On the duty of care, I appreciate the point. I have, I don't know, unfortunately, I guess, spent too much time in 230 space to say that I understand the point you're trying to make. I think the thing that will be helpful, especially, is the council on that regard. And, it would be helpful, which is why we specifically, wanted to include platforms, wanted to include, teens that would be covered by the bill, to have a sense of the types of content that they are using. Because I will say, I'm 41, I'm not a teen, I am not a parent of a teen, my daughter is 5. So I think that it would be useful to understand more and get their viewpoint on ways that the duty could be implemented, if they see ways that could unintentionally, right, impede their sort of free usage online, right? Because, obviously content moderation, we could probably have an entire panel on that. And I realize that is a tricky subject and we all grapple with it, but I do think that getting their input will be helpful. But, I think that as we move forward on this, we are certainly open to having conversations if there's language that needs to narrow the scope of that, or more sort of narrowly tailor that duty to make sure that we don't get in that situation. On the state AGs, I think respectfully, we may just agree to disagree on this, right? I mean, obviously, I'm a Republican. I work for Senator Blackburn. I think we, in Tennessee have a great attorney general, have had great attorney generals. I think we've seen a lot of good work by state attorney generals in this space. We appreciate, frankly, some of the lawsuits that they are leading and that they've joined, and, fully recognize that Adams members may be in a different spot, sort of having to deal with the lawsuits. But I think for us, and, I won't speak for Senator Blumenthal, but like coming from that role in his state, I think we saw an important role for the states to play here. So I think to us, it's a thing that we thought was important. Now, Lauren, on your question. So yeah, we tried to, initially when we drafted this, it was kind of everybody's a minor. And then we were having conversations, and then folks said, well, older teens are different than, a 13-year-old, for example. So let's think about how to do it. I think the idea was really more that there would be a little bit more kind of parental access to the tools for the younger child, the children, than there would be for the minors, but also recognize that it's possible that in attempts to redraft it with those distinctions, that there could still be places where, we mixed up or it just wasn't clear. So I think we are still open to trying to clarify how that would best work, recognizing that, yeah, older teens are going to be different than a kid that's 13. So we're certainly open if there's places where that is not clear. And then on FERPA, yeah, we did not intend to in any way preempt FERPA. It has been an ongoing conversation with ed tech platforms and trying to figure out how to interact with them, recognizing that there are some platforms that are more, they're not social media, right? I mean, they're sort of school focused, but then there are some where they're using actual, social media, or they're using these general platforms that can be used for school and not for school. And so we erred on the side of, covering all of them. We can certainly talk about if there's ways that would interfere with any type of tech platform in the school and their ability to provide educational content. We would hope not, but if there are cases of that, I think we're happy to hear it. But it was kind of, we had to make the decision one way or another, just carve them out or not. And, I think we made the decision to keep them, knowing that we could hear feelings about it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that live and in real time responses.
And I appreciate the feedback. So some of this is, we could keep talking about it if that's helpful for folks.
Excellent. And I mean, that's, first of all, it was very helpful and leads right into the next question of what are the next steps? Sort of, are you feeling that there are further amendments needed to pass? What discussions are happening in the Senate?
No, I mean, I don't think so. We've been having conversations with folks about how to perhaps better clarify the definition of, covered companies, and that's an ongoing conversation. And I'm not really in a position to say more about it now, but we're working with folks on that. My boss and Senator Blumenthal would like to move this, I would say as quickly as possible, also recognizing that, which we can talk about. I mean, there's a bigger situation with privacy and data security and these issues overall, and sort of what's going to happen with all of them. So, I don't know, could it move on the hotline? Sure. Could it move in lame duck? Sure. Right. Could it attach to a package? Yes, it always could. I think they're optimistic, but like, you just never know when you get to this time of year, what's going to happen and sort of where people are going to throw things. And yeah, I think Colin, who's in Senator Blumenthal's office, and I are definitely open, right? So like I said, if we didn't clarify child versus minor enough, right? Like, we're happy to do that. I don't think, we're not open to major changes, but if there are places where we have not been clear because of some drafting issue, or there's something that we just missed, then certainly still open.
That's super helpful. Thank you. I know a lot of people always find it helpful to hear from the people in the discussion from Capitol Hill, what's the latest, what's ongoing. So really appreciate that. Something Jamie said earlier is bringing in the states a little bit and the online safety concepts that are happening there. So as most of us know, California's Age Appropriate Design Code Act has now been signed into law, which is a sweeping law that would require companies to prioritize the best interests of the child when designing developing and providing online services, mandate privacy by design, apply to online services likely to be accessed by a minor, anyone under 18, and require default privacy settings to be set to high. So definitely some similarities with COSA there. What do we think about this bill? How does it affect our thinking at the national level? Will more states copy this? Is this sort of, does COSA touch on these concepts? Do we need a separate safety by design or age assurance law at the federal level? Please open reaction to California's recent work. I see you smile there, Lauren.
So I mean, I think it's worth rewinding to give a little bit of context for what California just did. And that's just to spend a minute to explain the UK's age appropriate design code, because what California did is, they believe building on that. So this was now 2 or 3 years old in the UK. The age appropriate design code in the US does a couple things. It follows a risk-based approach, right? That says that that acknowledges that kids at different ages are going to access services online and that need varying levels of parental control. And then as they age, get more independent. So it breaks kids down into buckets, right? 0 to 5, 6 to 9, the tween years, kind of 10 to 12, and then the early teens, so 13 to 15, and then finally kind of late teens, 16 to 17. And what it says is that a whole variety of things like parental controls, nudge techniques, defaults, community standards, those should vary. It makes sense for those things to vary as kids become, tweens and young teens and older teens. And I think actually this has been frankly a raging success, at least the UK's approach, because I think it's followed a risk-based approach that says, look, we understand like kids and teenagers benefit hugely a lot from what they're getting online, learning, connecting, accessing their world, finding new communities, all of that's great. And I think the UK code really, tries to balance kids and teens' rights to access information, express themselves, all of that while being appropriate to their age. Unfortunately, from my perspective, the California legislature took this great concept and frankly took it off the rails. They added liability provisions, which in turn, I think, add a de facto age verification requirement for the whole web, making platforms have to know essentially the age of everyone visiting their sites, and then holding them liable for not tailoring their services appropriately, and lumping together 17-year-olds with 2-year-olds, right? Even though their risks and needs are completely different. I think a lot of parents have appreciated things like the movie rating system, right? Even the video game rating system, because it gives them a lot of information about how to make informed choices for their kids. But I think the California law is probably closer to like, though it says age appropriate, it's probably closer to like the alcohol law, saying it's like 21 or else, right? And I know that a number of people have raised serious concerns about the age verification requirements actually potentially decreasing privacy. So great concept, really great concept. And again, the UK code has been a huge success, but I just worry that California has taken this in a unconstructive direction.
Thank you. No, I was going to bring in the UK code as well. Thank you for doing it. That's a great comparison there. Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the UK age appropriate design code, I think it's worth noting that, it's a little too soon to tell like what the long-term effects are of the UK age appropriate design code, because it's only been in effect. There's only been a compliance requirement since last September. So we haven't seen any enforcement action. And so advocates will say that it's been a massive success and has made the internet safer. Critics will say that we haven't seen any enforcement, so it must not be working. But I think the short answer is it's too soon to tell whether the code has been a success and whether it's going to set out to achieve what it intends to do. But I do think we can all agree that the bill has been successful in shifting the conversation about youth privacy. So California's age appropriate design code is proof of that. And I think it's very likely we're going to see these kids codes popping up in different parts of the country in future legislative sessions and across the globe. So I mean, the UK age appropriate design code and the Irish draft fundamentals for a child-oriented approach to data processing and other similar codes we've seen pop up have definitely influenced the conversation to bring teens into the conversation and not just talk about privacy, but also talk about safety, and to kind of acknowledge, the fact that different age groups might require different sensitivities, and maybe certain age groups should have more autonomy over their privacy from their parents than others. And I think that's a noteworthy goal. I think the California Age Group Design Code is setting out to address really real and important issues concerning young people, and I really admire that goal. I think it's possible that the code's methods could be a little far-reaching and have some unintended consequences, such as requiring platforms and companies to estimate age and collect more information than they normally would. But we'll see. And I think the next few years will be interesting, as I believe Andrew or Adam mentioned, the code will require compliance starting in 2024. So there will be some time to hear about guidance from California and what compliance looks like. And companies will have a little time to figure that out.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. All super important issues, and especially to talk about and get right if copycats are going to continue around the states and around the world. Just before moving on, Jamie, if you wanted to weigh in on this in terms of how this action affects the federal level.
Yes. I mean, it sort of feels like broader privacy, right? Again, and not to say, right, I mean, certainly we share the goals of what California did, which, I mean, maybe you'll never hear Republicans say that, but I think we're all right, like we're rowing in the same direction. We're obviously concerned because it's not feasible for a state to do its own thing here. The internet is not a state thing. It just doesn't work that way. Obviously, there are some things that are similar to what we did in COSA. There are things that have already been mentioned that I think go beyond. The preemption, I think for us is obviously the biggest thing out there is what are we going to do with one state hanging out? And then when we end up with 5 states, like we have with privacy, sort of general consumer privacy, what are we going to do and how is that going to work? I think that you see with UK and you see with us that clearly there is a focus for this and a need for this. And, I think we all are starting to think about how to, implement these protections because they're needed. As I said before, right, my boss hears this from folks every time she goes back to the state. We kept the UK children's code, in the back of our mind when we were drafting COSA. Obviously, we have a different overlay here in the US. There's no GDPR, so things are generally going to be a little bit different. It's a little bit broader. That's not to say that makes it worse necessarily. It's just a different environment. We have 230 here. They don't have 230 there, right? Like there are just things that they think about that are we just don't have here. So it's just not going to work here. But, I think that it clearly shows that there is some coalescing around a framework. I think it's just in the details how we kind of get there and what's going to work the best for, innovators and for consumers and for parents and schools, and how do we, make that work in practice.
Excellent. Thank you. No, that's really good to know that what's going on internationally and in the States is in your minds while we're shaping these federal legislation, because that's a part of what FOSI likes to talk about in terms of consistency. You said internet can't regulate state by state, let alone country to country and region to region. So very good to know that we're all trying to get on the same page here. And you queued up privacy perfectly for me. So moving a little bit from safety to privacy, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, COPPA 2.0 is the Senate's effort to update the 24-year-old children's privacy law and extend protections to young teens, while the ADPPA is the House's bill to address data privacy in a comprehensive way for all US users, with a small section pertaining to kids. What are the benefits of these bills? What do we like? Starting with the positives here. Open, anyone?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. I think as you talked about, COPPA 2.0 would, give the longstanding 1998 law a little bit of a revamp. And I think that there's something to be said about that, because the internet's changed, our conversations about privacy has changed, and I think it could be time for an update. And for example, I like that it would increase the age threshold from under 13 to under 17, because that would mean a whole group of minors whose information wasn't previously covered under COPPA would now receive heightened protections. I think the Youth Privacy and Marketing Division within the FTC is also interesting, and how the bill would establish this new division within the FTC. I think one thing we can learn from places like the UK and their age appropriate design code is that one thing they do that's really great is devote a lot of resources to the enforcement and guidance. And I think we should follow their lead, and having a youth privacy marketing division or something similar within the enforcement body could be really positive. The bill also, explicitly prohibits with limited exceptions, the collection of children and teens data for purposes of targeted marketing. And I think that this, clarifies some things that's in the original COPPA law and rule. And I think that explicit prohibition could be a positive thing. And then the last thing I'll say that I appreciate is that, there are unique protections to teens that are different from the protections to minors. So, for example, COPPA requires access and deletion rights to parents. So that means parents will have certain rights to access and delete the information that their young children under 13 have. And when COPPA increased the age range to under 7, or COPPA 2.0 increased the age range to under 17 instead of under 13, they wanted to keep that requirement, but acknowledge that it might make more sense for older youth to have some autonomy over their privacy. And so rather than, giving those access and deletion rights to parents, they require that the 13 through 16-year-old has those rights. Similarly, rather than verifiable parental consent, teens would be required to give consent. So kind of acknowledging the trend we've kind of talked about a few times of different age groups getting different kinds of privacy protections, and recognizing that the privacy conversation especially for teens, isn't only about privacy from companies, but also privacy from their parents, and acknowledging that there are certain levels of autonomy that they are entitled to.
So I'll just chime in here, and I think that COPPA 2.0, unfortunately, I'll disagree a little bit with Lauren. I think it fails to grapple kind of honestly with the ways in which COPPA 1.0 has and remains inconsistent with the ways that families are allowing their kids, particularly their tweens, to use technology. In our current COPPA law, there's this age 13 cutoff, and frankly, there have been many studies that have shown that parents of 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds in particular are increasingly lying about, or allowing their kids to lie about their age, because they, as parents, have comfort with their kids being on a service that might nominally require age 13, and that's just created a very perverse incentive for the parents to lie or allow the kids to lie. Great that the parent is controlling that, but that tells me that the standard is not consistent with how parents and families of tweens are operating. These are 12-year-olds who are wanting more independence, supervised, but wanting more independence, and parents are willing to give it to them. And so I think rather than take COPPA's age 13 date and push it up to 16, recognizing that the bill sets somewhat different rules for 16, I'd like to see a more honest grappling with kind of, is this actually in line with how parents of tweens and young teens are using technology today? I don't believe that it is. And the other concern I think that I have is that the bill has a what's called a constructive knowledge standard, right? So it makes it, I think it could actually make it harder for online platforms to serve kids. I'm thinking of the Alanis Morissette, You Ought to Know song, right? Right now there's an actual knowledge standard, right, to determine liability. Did you know that something bad was happening on your platform? Constructive knowledge standard, I think will further disincentivize platforms from trying to tailor their services to the age of a user, even when that user is a tween or younger, because those two things are at odds, and I think that's at odds with the spirit of the UK code as well.
Excellent. Thank you. No, perfect. I was going to ask about the negatives and sort of unintended consequences. So thank you for bringing that in. And, we'll continue one more on this, but just a reminder to please submit any questions you have. I know this is a wide ranging conversation, so audience, love to hear your questions and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But to follow up on this specifically, so what can be done to fix it, the COPPA 2.0 or ADPPA? What amendments need to come in before final passage or changes? I know Adam just mentioned a couple. Happy to hear from him again, or Lauren or Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, right, and I think I told you, I don't really like to sort of throw other people's bills under the bus, so I won't. I mean, I think that all of the bill sponsors on both of the bills have tried to work with, my boss in a real way, and we appreciate that. So if we can, be helpful to them, then I think we're happy to do it. I think both bills have good parts to them, and there's things we would change in both of them. I don't know that I want to get into all the details. I think it's a broader question about sort of, is Congress going to get this stuff done now, or are we not? And are we going to get it done on kids? Are we going to get it done on consumer? Are we going to get both, or are we getting nothing, right? And so, I think that's really what we're grappling with at the moment. And so it's not that the details of the bills don't matter, because they do, but it's also the question of, like, are we doing this? Do we have an appetite for any of it right now? Or because frankly, it seems like a lot of the tech legislation, which means like my whole portfolio, is basically just up and died. So it's just not clear we're doing anything on tech this year, for better or for worse. And so, that may just be a broader theme. And unfortunately, some good bills like COSA or other things might just fall, prey to that at this point, all of them. So yeah, but I'm happy to let my fellow panelists delve into more specifics.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just add one thing I think is worth kind of taking a step back to look at, is I do think that there has been a net effect, positive effect from the UK code, and frankly bills being introduced on what the platforms themselves have done in terms of adding more tools, right? And so sometimes I think regulation and proposed regulation does have this effect of I mean, I was worked within companies, and I know a lot of times company people are saying, well, there's this bill out there, what could we be doing in the spirit that's consistent with the spirit of those rules, right? So for example, I mean, I think, over the last year, Instagram faced a lot of criticism as a result of some of Frances Haugen's revelations. And I think what you saw in turn was Instagram rolling out, new tools, right, for users, and new steps, right, to shield younger teens from certain types of content, to provide, nudges around people who, may be considering self-harm, right? There's new tools in the metaverse and virtual reality that the company has rolled out. I think that regulation, proposed bills do have had and will continue to have a positive effect on services building more tools for kids and for parents.
Thank you. And I wanted to just weigh in. We do have an audience question that touches on most of this, from Alexandra Matos, asking, what role will XR play in online data and privacy for minors? XR meaning virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. So are these bills maybe forward-looking enough to include considerations about metaverse and mixed reality, including privacy, but also maybe COSA? Happy to hear your thoughts on this.
I don't know, bills are never forward-looking enough, so and that's not really to crap on us. It's just, I think that there's so much we don't know about how these technologies are gonna change sort of the world we see. And I should say, right, I'm sure then there are folks who are going to say, well, obviously that's a case as to why you need to do nothing. And I am going to disagree with that, because we have been living with a lot of these platforms, not necessarily the metaverse, but we've been living with sort of the Web 2.0 version, as people will say, for long enough that I think we do recognize what some of the market failures are. And market failures do exist even for folks that say do nothing. So yeah, but I don't think that, not to say we're not thinking about those technologies, we certainly are, but it's like, we're grappling with how they are in sort of the world we are in, and not necessarily with the sort of future. metaverse world. But I do know there are companies that are trying to think about it sort of beyond meta, right? And they're thinking about specifically kids safety in this space. I think Lego was one we had heard from that was doing some work on it. And so they are trying to think about that, which, we do appreciate, and we'll, call out folks that are doing a good job on it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean,
I would just add
advice?
too. Yeah, I would just add too. I don't think there will be new technological areas, but companies have also, Jamie, I think talked about this, have learned a lot from the current laws they have to live under, GDPR, right? Things like that. And so I wouldn't necessarily assume that a new space is like Wild West unregulated, because there are baseline rules that are in place now that that new services have to live by as well. So just to kind of work, but I agree, there will be novel questions that will come up, right, that we don't know yet, and that may be room for both platform rules, but potentially regulation as well.
Excellent. Thank you. I know a lot of this we're focusing on Congress and legislation. I want to bring in also, what is the administration's role in this? Most of us know the president brought online safety and privacy into focus by naming them and highlighting Frances Haugen's work in his State of the Union. The White House has also had working groups and listening sessions on content moderation and harmful content online. Has the White House weighed in directly on any of these bills? And the administration does seem to be laying out specifics, like maybe banning targeted advertising to kids, but then letting Congress take the lead to come up with actual bill text. Just curious how involved they are in this. What's the administration's role if they're weighing in with the bills? Maybe Jamie can start, and if others have an idea of what the role of the administration is. Cheerleader, ideas person, more.
Well, this is where I wish I had my colleague in Senator Blumenthal's office, who I think is listening, but is not a panelist. He could answer that more, right? I mean, they're not calling us, which is fine. I think you heard the shout out. So I think that we know that generally they support doing something on this, and that's our understanding. But, I don't know that my office necessarily is, has feelings about whether we need an endorsement. I don't think that that's our, right. It's just not our, our people. But, we certainly see that there is a general trend in the country where groups are, aligned and concerned, and this message is out there on both sides of the aisle. And, we've got advocates from all sorts of groups that are sort of behind where these things are going. So, I think if the White House agrees that this is a good way to go, then we appreciate, that they're joining with us on that message. So, yeah.
Thank you. We'll have to have Blumenthal on next.
Exactly. That's more their conversation than mine.
I don't know if Lauren or Adam have thoughts on the role of the White House as well.
Not the White House, but I would say watch the FTC. The FTC has just recently put out an ANPRM, which is kind of a fancy word for asking a lot of questions. They asked 95 questions about data privacy, and there's a section about kids' privacy and security online. But it's one of many. So I think it's an open question about will the FTC proceed to the next step, which is propose rules there. There is separately the FTC and a long simmering, gestating rulemaking on COPPA. And so I think they're going to probably face the question internally of, do they just focus on that current rulemaking around COPPA and maybe, look at that, or do they try to use this new data privacy rulemaking to potentially go beyond COPPA, and we'll see what happens there.
I do want to butt in to be like, what is happening there, right? I mean, I get it. Obviously, we all have concerns about privacy. But yeah, I mean, the COPPA rulemaking has been open since 2018. I worked on it in a prior job. It's been open for 3 years. It's like, what? Okay. I mean, yeah, it just feels like they're taking on a lot, and I'm just not sure what the end goal is with all of it at this point. We appreciate, I think, that everybody shares the goals, but like, that's a broad digital surveillance, as they call it, rulemaking. And I don't know what they're planning to do. I don't know how that's planning to interact with COPPA. I don't know how that plans to interact with proposals for, COSA, for federal privacy legislation. We don't know. And so I think that raises a lot of concerns for people.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. I was going to bring in all the work that the FTC has been doing, especially recently, and how that impacts what you all are doing on Capitol Hill. So thank you. I did want to bring in another audience question. What are each of the panelists hopeful about in the realm of digital safety and privacy? If we zoom out, how are each of them feeling about the state of tech legislation in the US and where the US is globally? Maybe Lauren can start on that.
Sounds good. I think that's a great question. And I think I'm optimistic that, the legislation we've seen this year, across the globe, the bills we've seen, the enforcement actions from the FTC and statements like the FTC's statement on COPPA and education technology, I think shows that kids' privacy and online safety is a priority. And I think it's going to continue to be a big part of the conversation. COPPA 2.0 has been introduced in previous sessions, as has the Kids Act. And I think that's telling. I think it shows that regardless of whether the bills we've talked about today move or whether we see new laws pop up in the next year, a lot of these bills are years in the making. And I think it's great that the privacy discussion and is including online safety now when we talk about kids and their well-being, and that I think things like the UK Age Appropriate Design Code and the Irish Fundamentals and now the California Age Appropriate Design Code are only going to continue to influence the conversations we're seeing.
Great optimism. Thank you. Adam, you're next.
Yeah, so I would say that I think one of the things that's interesting to me is I do think the pandemic kind of forced technology to play an important role in a lot of families' lives. It was how kids were connecting to school. In a lot of cases, staying connected to family members is how a lot of us stayed connected to each other. And so what I'm kind of seeing and noticing, and I have 3 kids under 12, and I think the conversation about how we use we use technology responsibly in our family and other families use it in their family is kind of reached like almost a new level of maturity. But parents are really grappling with a lot of these, like there's a lot of hard questions. I mean, I'm sure you guys at FOSI hear this a lot. I'm sure a lot of organizations have. There are a lot of hard questions, and a lot of it is like, well, is this app safe? Is that app safe? Should I let my kid? What age are you letting your kid do this? Do Minecraft or Roblox or something like that, right? And so I do think that fundamentally, I think most families would say, technology has been playing, it does play a positive role for kids, but there is also a hunger on the part of, I think, many parents for what are the best practices? How do I set reasonable limits? I think it's wonderful that the platforms are offering more tools, right? Because like if you're a parent, you're just kind of like, you feel kind of helpless in the face of all this. When to see, iOS, Google Play, or Instagram, but roll out these new tools, I do think it allows a parent to take more control over the situation and feel a little less hopeless. And so that gives me optimism that I think you see a lot of parents trying to think, well, how do I raise my kid to be kind of a responsible digital citizen, be mindful of the dangers that are out there, but also frankly recognizing that there's that technology is opening up a whole world of possibility and opportunity, and that's fundamentally good.
Thank you. Jamie, your thoughts on the global, larger context?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, my daughter is 5, and so she's just starting to tackle some of these things with a lot of supervision. But, when I was, I guess, high school age is when the internet was just starting to become a thing. And we spent a lot of time on AOL and Prodigy and ICQ because I was old and clearly a tech geek. And I think things have just gotten even more crazy since then. So for me, I am optimistic to see that folks, groups and policymakers and parents and physicians, and that there is now more of a concerted effort, whether that be from platforms that are sort of willing to make these efforts, or it is from us, holding feet to the fire, or it's some combination of both. I am hopeful that by the time that, my daughter gets to that age where I feel like I could trust her to be doing the things that I was doing, it will be hopefully a safer and better and easier to supervise environment. And, we don't have to worry about like groomers and illegal drugs and things like that. Not to say that everything will be, some black box that's, perfectly contained and it's, nothing bad ever happens. But I'm optimistic that, we can sort of get there collectively to a place where, she can learn things, but also not be exposed to horrible, unsafe things too.
Totally. No, it's super. I like the optimism here that we're coming to a close on. And Adam, thank you for referencing the conversation with families and parents and caregivers. Yes, FOSI has a lot of work to do with there. We have our GDP, our Good Digital Parenting materials on FOSI.org that helps facilitate families have these conversations about, what age to get a tablet or a phone, how to have these conversations and set limits individually on a case-by-case basis. Also, you mentioned about parental controls and the general overwhelm. We have definitely pushed for parental controls must be paired with parental education across the board. So that's definitely important parts of all of this. And we are running out of time. So I'll go to the final question for each panelist in just 30 seconds or less. What is the one thing that you want the audience to take away from our conversation here today? We can start with Jamie.
Okay, that policymakers are listening to your concerns and, we want to hear them, and it's not just calling and leaving a voicemail, right? We actually do hear these things, and please reach out.
Excellent. I think people will definitely do that. Thank you. Lauren or Adam?
I'll just say, watch this space. I think it's changing. I think kids and student and teen privacy is going to continue to be a big part of the tech policy conversation, and the landscape is going to continue to change. And it's an exciting time to be in this space.
Yep, and I would just say, I think that keep an eye on this dynamic between, I think, the age-appropriate design dynamic and kind of a doubling down on COPPA dynamic. I think the age-appropriate design, as implemented in the UK, has had a very positive effect in terms of encouraging services to design appropriately, and I think that, frankly, is very much in line with families' experience. I'd like to see policymakers kind of learn from the success that's had.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you specifically to our fantastic panelists, Jamie Suskin, Lauren Merck, and Adam Kovakovich, for such a great discussion. Thank you also to all the FOSI staff who put this event together and shared all the links in the chat and more. And thank you to all of the audience for tuning in and submitting these thoughtful questions. One more quick plug before we go. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, as Lauren mentioned, it's ongoing and evolving, and all things online safety, FOSI's annual conference is back in person at the Intercontinental Wharf Hotel in Washington, D.C. on Monday, November 14th. Registration is open on our website, fosi.org/events. Thank you all again, and have a great day.